Okay, good morning and welcome everyone. Welcome to the third session of the 2021 Citrus Research Board Summer Webinar Series. I'm Stephanie Pereira with the UC Statewide IPM program. I'm also here with Dr. Melinda Klein of the Citrus Research Board, who will introduce our speakers, and Peter Cosina, who will run the poll questions and troubleshoot any technical problems. Please also note that this webinar is designed for growers and agricultural pest management professionals. Master gardeners can certainly benefit from participating, but the pest management methods presented, especially the pesticides, are not to be followed without a clear understanding of their legal use in home environments. So with that, I am going to hand this over to Dr. Melinda Klein, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Ben Faber. He's the Regional Farm Advisor for Ventura County. He's been a farm advisor in Santa Barbara and Ventura County since 1989, covering issues associated with soil, water, and subtropical tree crops. He has also covered pests and diseases of key crops over the years, while advising on soil and water management issues to improve production and reduce degradation. Today, Dr. Faber will provide a regional update. Dr. Ben?
Yeah, good morning. So what we're going to talk about are three things that are popping up this time. Dry root rot, which is a sudden collapse of trees. And this pops up when we go from cold to hot to cold to hot. And this has been showing up since January. We're going to talk about Argentine ant, which is a peculiarity of Southern California and coastal California. It goes all the way up to Napa Valley, but it's not really in the Central Valley. And then we have the sunburn issue, which is a problem that, the trees never get acclimated to the heat when it shows up. So dry root rot, this is a dramatic disease. In the center of it is where lemons are grown. It'll happen in a weekend, and it happens right as we go into a heat spell. And if you cut around at the base of the tree, you'll always find this staining. And the staining is caused by Fusarium root rot, Fusarium fungus. But it's really a problem that's has multiple causes. It has to have a wound, it has to have damage from weeding and from gophers and from mice, which allows the Fusarium to get in there. And then you need this stress to happen. And it happens usually to 1, 2, 3, 4-year-old trees up to about 15 years of age. And if they make it past 15, they'll usually live forever. It only affects lemons and willows. And with the expansion of lemons in the Central Valley, expect to see this showing up there too. It's a primary pathogen, meaning once you got it, the thing is dead, forget it, pull it out. It can often be confused with armillaria, which is oak root fungus. And oak root fungus, if you pull away the bark at the base, you'll see this hyphal matting. And sometimes you can bring oak root fungus tree back by exposing the base. Generally, though, it leads to tree death. So once you start seeing something like these mushrooms at the base of the tree, it's really time to take the tree out. We see this commonly in Ventura at the base of hillsides where erosion has moved material, and erosion, when it rains, moves contaminated material out of the hillsides into the low-lying orchards. Anyway, it's hard to turn around, and it's often best to pull the tree. This is a California citrus problem that is associated with Southern California. And this is Argentine ant. Argentine ant is a farmer that takes care of scale and Asian citrus psyllid. It farms it for the honeydew, and it protects it. And here's a wonderful case of that was developed at Mark Hoddle's lab that shows the Argentine ant. You see it's chewing away at tamarixia here, and it's charging the tamarixia, and the Argentine ant is protecting the psyllids because it's getting a honeydew from it. So Argentine ant is our major problem. And the HODL lab has been working at developing a algae-based delivery system for bringing pesticides in to control Argentine ant. It's a biodegradable material that can be put out and rapidly breaks down. They've tested 17 different pesticides and they all seem to be fairly effective. Boric acid material that we've used in boric acid bait stations just doesn't seem to be as effective as these other pesticides. Okay, and heat. Okay, heat is a problem in citrus along the coast. When citrus adapts to heat as it can in Fresno and in the desert, it is a tough bunny. It can take about as much heat as you can deliver, as you can deliver water. Here along the coast, the trees are turned on and off and on and off by the cold that we get. You know, daytime temperatures can be 85, 90 degrees, but they'll drop down to 45 degrees at night sometimes during the summertime. And this really does not set up the tree for an ability to handle heat. And so we'll get things like Bactrisphaeria showing up, and this can show up as heat stress. Basically, it's a water stress, and if the tree is well hydrated, it can deal with the heat. But all too often we get lax because it's kind of cool and people are responding to the temperatures. But really, you know, we'll get in the upcoming days, we're going to get 100 degrees and we're going to get Santa Ana's blowing in, and the Santa Ana's really compound this thing, causing wind scarring. This water stress that's developed, and again, this water stress can develop simply with the high winds, clear skies, and we'll get leaf blights, which are Bactrisphaerias. We'll get stem blights, which is damage to the stems. We'll actually get this gumming that looks like copper deficiency, which I've seen in the Moore Park area quite commonly. And in the case of star ruby grapefruit, we get this clearing of the leaf that occurs. So heat stress and water stress are not the same. Heat stress literally is too much heat. The citrus tree in an environment that it's consistently hot can handle heat stress, but here along the coast, the leaves do not develop an ability to handle the heat. Usually we deal with this through maintaining a good water relationship, meaning you get out there and you irrigate prior to the heat wave to hydrate the tree. There are some materials that can improve resistance to heat stress. The sunscreen materials like Surround and Screen Duo, they work very well. They keep the stomata open. Stomata are the way that the tree radiates heat. It moves the heat out of the tree by evaporation through the stomata called transpiration. There are some materials out there like Vapor Guard, Envy, Wilt Knot, Anti-Stress. On the web, I've seen 3 or 4 others. These materials close stomata and they reduce transpiration and they increase heat stress. And you look at the advertising and they all say, oh, it improves heat tolerance. If you go online and look for any sort of information that is backed up, the only thing I ever found was something out of South Africa looking at mandarins, and these wilt knot envy type materials really did not, they actually enhanced heat stress. Anyway, sunscreen or just white paint for sun protection works very well. And we're doomed. Santa Anas are a condition of Southern California. We get these low pressure areas that drag winds and heat out of the middle of out of the Rockies, basically, and they blow through here. And it used to be a fairly common issue simply in late fall and the winter time, but now pretty much we're seeing it happen every month of the year. So we need to develop along the coast, especially methods for dealing with heat stress. And in the case of avocados, which are so much more susceptible, we're looking at overhead sprinkler irrigation for cooling. So the world has changed. Used to be we'd have several freeze events in Ventura County, Santa Barbara, 15 or so nights where we'd run frost control. We don't do that any longer, but man, we've got a lot of heat that we're having to deal with. And 118 degrees is not something most plants want to deal with, certainly along the coast. So with that, I'll turn it over to Melinda.
Thank you, Ben, for that excellent presentation. And so please welcome our next set of speakers, Casey Creamer and Austin Ewell. Casey assumed his role as the president CEO of the California Citrus Mutual in February of 2019, after serving the prior year as the executive vice president. He has a strong vision for the statewide organization's future, and he previously came from work that he was doing with water. Austin is an attorney at law specializing in land use, water supply, and regulatory matters. He's the president of the Ewell Group, which I hope I pronounced right, and which is involved in farming, water supply, land development, regulatory consulting, and government solutions. Austin also serves on the Fresno County Planning Commission, the National Park Service Citizens Advisory Board, and the executive director for the Water Blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley. Today, they will discuss the current state of affairs surrounding California water. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Melinda, and thanks, Austin, for joining me. Again, Casey Creamer with California Citrus Mutual, and we have the daunting task of talking about water currently in California, the state of water in the middle of a drought. So I'm sure the things we talk about today are not exciting, may not be pleasant to hear, but hopefully at the end of the session, you understand that there's actually people working to try to make things better and some actual solutions and a path forward. So, and then always we want to have this open dialogue. And so as questions come in or things, we'll keep our presentation short, but feel free to ask us questions either during the webinar or myself. As I'm always available, cell phone, email, call me anytime, because water issues are incredibly complex. And that sort of leads us into, I'm going to open up a little bit the presentation, and then Austin, turn it over to Austin, talk about some things that he's doing, and then I'll close at the end. We'll have a few poll questions at the end. But again, water policy in California is about as tough as it gets, especially in the middle of the drought. We know growers out there have zero water allocations. Groundwater pumping availability is a problem even without SGMA being fully implemented. The ability to pump is, with groundwater tables getting lower, with pumps going dry, because we're still in this pandemic, with shortage of supplies, labor, and materials is also a huge problem. So we hear you, we understand a lot of these problems are out there, and we're trying to do everything we can to make the situation a little bit better. Why is California water so complex? One, let's start with the operations. In California, it's not just California officials, but you've got the federal partnership as well. 2/3 of the water storage capacity is owned and operated by the federal government, and 2/3 of the pumping capacity, moving water out of the Delta, is owned and operated by the state government. And so you really need that joint state and federal cooperation to be able to move water. And of course, a lot of times those policies of operation sometimes conflict. There's been a long history of a coordinated operations agreement or COA that's been in place, and where sort of behind the scenes, the operators sort of address resource concerns, whether it be water quality issues, the implementation of the Endangered Species Act. Keep in mind, there are two Endangered Species Act. There's a Federal Endangered Species Act, or ESA, And then you also have the California Endangered Species Act, and there are species listed under California that are not listed in the Fed, and that conflict of legal compliance is something that's been a major sticking point, at least with the last administration and the lawsuit that's currently there in place. And so right now there's a conflict within the Delta, the San Joaquin Delta, where a lot of the water from Northern California moves to Southern California in that sort of coordinated operations agreement. You have the federal government revise the biological opinions, which govern the federal side of it. And then California implemented its own permit here recently, which controls how they operate in the Delta. This is a major problem, and hopefully Austin is going to figure out a way to solve this moving forward. So that's just on the operations. That's incredibly complex, and if everybody's not working together, it's a major problem for ag, but also for the Southern California populations as well. We also know that water is highly political. It shouldn't be, but it is. The narrative of fish versus farms is always out there, but in reality, I think it's a whole lot more complex than that. It's rural versus urban. Votes matter, and where you have the votes tends to affect water policy and ag being mostly rural with limited voting and limits to our influence on political leaders is a bit of a challenge. You also have in water divisions. Water is highly local. You've got Northern California where there's lots of water, and then you've got Southern California where the people are, which is pretty dry. You also have within California, you have east versus west issues, and I'm talking about growers, or that can probably be better described as upstream versus downstream users. There are conflicts from time to time, and their views on water tend to be different. Now with the implementation, especially with the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, you have surface water rights holders versus wide area growers, people with solely reliant on groundwater pumping. And so those are also different viewpoints and different solution sets to the issues. Then the other issue I think that's out there is you have for basically the West of the United States versus the rest of the country. And what I mean by that is you have the dry, arid West. A lot of it's California. You can count Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona as part of that is major need for water. Then you have the rest of the country, which is, doesn't have the same water issues. And so the need for infrastructure at the federal level is there. But when you start counting political leaders, you've got 435 members of Congress, and there's probably maybe 10 or so, maybe 15 at the most, that are representing California, trying to improve the water situation. So it's a daunting task when you think about the number of politicians that you need to get on your side. You need at least 51% to get something done at the federal level. So it's highly political. There's highly complex operations. I don't say any of that to say that nothing can be done. I think a lot can be done. But in order to really work on the solutions, you really have to understand the complexity and the problems that exist, and even people that are trying to do the right thing, the sort of constraints that are on them to be able to do something for water. And so I know that's probably exciting to hear, but I think we've got a plan on how to maximize the system, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But why don't I stop there and turn it over to Austin Ewell. Austin is one of the guys that we've worked with. I've got to know Austin a little bit through the Kings River system. My prior job, he's got a long family history within the Kings River system. Went back to the federal government to work under the prior administration, was highly involved in these sort of water conflicts, and came back after serving in the administration. And Austin's really somebody who can work across the aisle, both within California and at the federal level, with Democrats and Republicans to try to get things moving forward, which is what I think is needed if we're going to get any solutions around water. So with that, Austin, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll come back and we'll answer any questions people have.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Casey. And Melinda, thank you for the introduction. I do think on the closed caption, when you said my last name, it might have said Ewell, but I want to rest everybody assured that it's not my last name. It's Ewell. Though a lot of this work tends to bring some controversy. I tend to avoid any evil approaches. But as Casey had mentioned, and most of you, I'm sure, are aware, I saw a significant portion of the audience is from Southern California, and recognize the complexities surrounding water here in California. And as Casey had touched, the predominant urban areas within the state rely on imported water. That's the case of whether you're in the city of San Francisco or you're in the city of Los Angeles. And it's that movement of water over the decades, over the century, has caused significant strife and challenges. And at present day, we find ourselves, especially with the implementation 100 years after the surface water rights system was put into place here in California in 1914. We found ourselves in 2014, the last state in the West to pass and implement comprehensive groundwater management. And as Casey touched on, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act really put especially the San Joaquin Valley at a unique set of crossroads. It really put a limitation on long-term limitation on the amount of water that can be pumped in order to maintain sustainable levels and those goals within SGMA. Now, historically, what we had seen leading up to that, especially because of this necessity for imported water throughout the state, we saw as through regulation, through management, through climate change and other factors, a reduction of the amount of surface water that we see, especially here in the San Joaquin Valley. And so naturally, growers and users of that water source, when that surface water source wasn't available to be imported, they turned to groundwater sources. And there was an expansion of footprint due to economic factors, which also increased the amount of groundwater that was being used. Now, with SGMA in place and the requirement to meet the sustainability goals throughout the sub-basins, especially here in the San Joaquin Valley, there is a significant deficit for all the collective uses, which some organizations have calculated nearly 2 million, if not greater, acre feet of water deficit that we need to make up. So picturing that somewhat as the water gap, in particular here in the San Joaquin Valley. And so, as Casey touched on, water is extremely complex, but also very interconnected. In a year like this, we've seen with allocations for most of the state near zero, if not at zero, and as operational plans, especially highlighting the importance of Lake Shasta, which is many of you know is the anchor of the federal water system built by Reclamation. Lake Shasta, which feeds into the Sacramento, and became a very highlighted. It's become a very highlighted water reservoir for the state for a number of political reasons, but as well as because of water management. And as the operations plan that was put together this year and submitted to the State Water Board from the Department of Water Resources, as well as from Bureau of Reclamation, because of that interconnectivity, there was a real ask for balance to try to be maintained. That balance for the water supply and water levels for cold water temperature for salmon, as Casey had touched on. You've got two biological opinions, which were put into place for operational and protection provisions for salmon, which is overseen by the National Marine Fisheries Service, housed within the Department of Commerce. And you also have protections in particular for the Delta smelt, which are overseen by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, housed within the Department of Interior. And any of you who have worked with government, just the fact that those two agencies are housed in two separate federal departments, provided significant complexities and challenges with coordinating those efforts. Then sprinkle on, obviously, the coordinated operations with the state and the shared facilities and the respective organizations that oversee that. And you have significant challenges which are highlighted in a year like this when the hydrology as minimal as we've seen since 1977 and potentially more severe than that. And we'll see as the year kind of plays out. So highlighting, the situation that we find ourselves in, but there is some hope. And because of that interconnectivity, because of the unique set of crossroads that we find ourselves at, especially with SCMA, there's really been a recognition by kind of a new group of leaders throughout the state, and in particular here in the San Joaquin Valley, that recognize the importance of collaborating, recognize that one, there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that can be done in order to solve this, and it can't be solved for just one set of stakeholders. Because of the interconnectivity, it needs to be pursued together. And that in itself is challenging and daunting, but worth the pursuit. And so in the past couple of years, an organization called the Water Blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley was formed by a number of parties recognizing that this pursuit could not be done alone, and the importance of bringing stakeholders to the table. That in turn, late last year, led to the birth, if you will, of the San Joaquin Valley Water Collaborative Action Program, which is hosted through Stanford University Water in the West, as well as Fresno State University, as well as the Central Valley Community Foundation. And through that organization, in conjunction with Blueprint, who's working on the with a focus of the technical aspects associated with some of the infrastructure components, the movement of water, where water needs to be placed, that connectivity to the benefit of drinking water sources as well as environmental resources, is in pursuit of what we'll call solution sets. As I talked about, there's a water gap of several million acre feet that needs to be filled, and some combination of tools need to be put to use in order to accomplish that. And the blueprint is looking at opportunities, multi-benefit opportunities that would allow for helping fill that gap. And the collaborative action program through Stanford and Fresno State is allowing those stakeholders, made up of roughly about 5 caucuses, which includes agriculture, water agencies, environmental, drinking water advocates, as well as local government, to sit down collectively, come to an agreement on the problem that we face, recognizing each other's problem, and then looking at solution sets in order to address those problems. So quick highlight on some of those components. As I'd mentioned, recharge is a significant focus, but we in the Valley and other parts in the state rely on imported water. So we need to do as much as we possibly can with local water supplies, but we also have to look at opportunities for flood flows, excess water supplies, so that those can be moved in wetter years, which in a year like this, we all wish was quicker in the cycle. However, they will come again. They may be more flashier as climate change occurs and continues to occur. But when it does, we need facilities in order to capture that water. So our aging infrastructure, especially the backbones of here in the Valley, whether that's the California Aqueduct, whether it's the Delta Mendota Canal, the San Luis Canal, the Friant Kern Canal, the Madera Canal, those items, those canal and those conveyance facilities need to be repaired as they have been affected through subsidence and just over due to aging and reduction of capacity. So those need to be fixed, and we need to look at ways to move water east and west so that when it is in excess, it can be moved, and identify those areas for recharge that have multiple benefits to the drinking water supplies in communities, since more than 90% of the communities, disadvantaged communities and severely disadvantaged communities here in the Central Valley rely on groundwater for the drinking water sources. So how can we help to improve those through recharge as well as connectivity potentially to surface water systems? And then how do we look at areas for recharge which may have benefits to environmental resources, whether it's corridor connectivity, habitat creation, and alternative uses. And we also have to look at, as land comes out of production, which inevitably it will, what are the alternative uses for that property? As I mentioned, with that gap and these efforts to reduce that gap, but without anything being done, we're looking at possibly 1 million acres, specifically here in the Central Valley, which is generally farms about 5 million acres. So 20% of that acreage coming out of production in perpetuity. And so what do we do as a plan, not only next year, but 5, 10, 20, 40 years from now, in order to plan for this change and evolution of what the valley looks like? But how do we reduce the impact, especially economically here, that disproportionately affects a lot of the communities that are already disadvantaged? And so the blueprint, the water blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley, has that daunting task and has taken that on to work with the entire valley in order to pursue those solutions in a collaborative manner. And so we've made a lot of progress, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think we're hopeful that we can make a difference and improve the valley and allow it to continue to thrive. That concludes my rambling on, but happy to take any questions or.
Yeah. Thanks, Austin,
okay.
for that. We'll open it up for questions in maybe just 1 second. Let me just talk a little bit more about citrus specific issues in the drought and what CCM is doing with that sort of overarching, discussion. One, we understand, the water blueprint for the San Joaquin Valley. If you're in Southern California, you may say, how does this benefit me? I think it's probably 90 to 95% of citrus production is south of the Delta. And part of the water blueprint goal is to put together a plan, an economic analysis that shows the impact of the lack of water supply. And really a large portion of the water supply that is available is through the Delta in excess of environmental standards. We think that there's water there. And so while the San Joaquin Valley will benefit from that, everybody who is south of the Delta will benefit from improvements in the Coordinated Operations Agreement, the Endangered Species Act. That's really the crux of the problems within the state centered around the Delta. And so that's one benefit to Southern California. Secondarily, the infrastructure needs that are there, we're advocating. The blueprint is one opportunity to get water agencies together to find a common solution to advocate. And you really need that to bring solutions to the entire state. So just want to draw some attention to Southern California as well, outside of the San Joaquin Valley. Obviously, there's some areas in Ventura which are almost completely reliant on the local water system, and there's potentially some improvements here or opportunities in the future, and we understand those. But what is CCM doing? One, the first thing is we're coordinating with the water agencies. A heavy component of citrus is within the Friant water system, but also relying on the State Water Project as well. We're in active communication with our water agencies, your water agencies, to get the best available information so that when we go advocate in Washington, D.C., or within the state, that we are informed and we're not working at cross purposes with the water agencies. They represent you at the local level, and it's our job to make sure that we're connected with them to make sure we're pushing the ball as far as we possibly can in cooperation with your water agencies. Second thing is communicating with the administration, especially here in California. You do have an administration at Department of Water Resources, at Natural Resources Agency, California Department of Food and Ag. You have people within those agencies that are working hard to try to remedy the effects of the drought to the best of their ability within the confines that they have. There's always things that we'd like to do more, but I can tell you that they are working hard to try to minimize the impacts of this drought. We are communicating with them the significant impacts that you all are facing and keeping the pressure as much as we possibly can on them to get solutions. And we can get into more detail there if you have questions on that. And then advocating for solutions. We're looking for statewide solutions. The state has a budget surplus. Part of it's from a federal stimulus, but the state has a surplus. Initially, there was about $300 million for SGMA implementation that was being advanced. And we advocated for more. We advocated for at least $1 billion in the middle of a drought, as in the middle of growers having to implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. $300 million is simply not enough. Frankly, $1 billion is not enough, but the administration did put forward a proposal that included $1 billion for what we would consider water infrastructure. That included the $300 million for SGMA implementation, $200 million for subsidence repairs, which is not enough, but it is a down payment for it, and we're working to get that higher. And also $500 million for land repurposing. Land repurposing, if you're a grower, you probably hear that term and you think land retirement. We don't believe that that's land retirement. We believe that is all land repurposing. Some of it may be retirement, but what we're advocating within the administration is that the majority of that money needs to be used for recharge facilities, because if you're just taking land out of production, it only solves one half of the problem. If you are putting in recharge, it takes some area out of production to reduce the demand, but it also brings in that excess capacity when there is flood water to put it in the ground. And so what do you do in time of a drought? You prepare for the flood. And so I think that's what we're trying to do. It's what we're trying to communicate to the administration, to put resources in place. So as growers are struggling with high water prices or no water availability or fallowing, the state is coming through with some resources to help you implement SGMA, help the state implement SGMA, so that we're prepared and when the time that we do have some excess water. And I'd say finally, the other thing that we're doing is trying to keep ag and water agencies together. This problem is hard enough if we're divided. It's actually impossible if we're divided. So getting all the groups together through the blueprint, through other efforts, forcing the water agencies to talk, forcing ag interests to talk, to come up with a common set of solutions. If we don't do that, we're going to get nowhere in water. And so we're doing our best to try to keep everyone together to work on common solutions. So with that, I'll stop there. I know we've got a few questions in the queue.
All right, so I'll start with a question from Thomas. It asks, what is the chance to change the timeline of SGMA and start the requirements sooner?
Yeah, start the requirements sooner. Well, the plans have been put into place. All the GSAs have had to turn in plans in the critically overdrafted areas. Those are currently being reviewed by Department of Water Resources. And I think a lot of the agencies are waiting on that feedback. I know of some GSAs that are starting to implement pumping reductions next year. Westlands Water District is one. I think it's 1.3 acre feet in the next year. And others are sort of waiting on a response from DWR. As far as speeding up the timelines, I don't know. We get into a second year of a drought. Maybe there's an effort in the state to try to speed up the timelines. I know from the other end of the equation, there are people who wanted to open up SGMA to delay the timeframes a little bit longer, give agencies a little bit longer timeframe, give growers a little bit longer timeframe to implement it. I think that is a long shot as well, unfortunately. So the other fear is when you open up a significant law like SGMA that has multiple interests moving in different directions, you run a risk of making it even worse than what it is. And one of the things that we're trying to preserve with SGMA is local control, to let growers and the local water managers manage their supplies to the best of their ability. The last thing that we want is the State Water Resources Control Board managing your local groundwater supplies. And so I'm very negative on reopening up the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I'll let Austin add on if he's got any
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I'll just touch on. So there are a couple different criteria components of I think approximately 4 within SCMA that allow if certain triggers occur, which relate to groundwater quality, subsidence, and other items, it triggers additional activity and potential activity by the state itself. And so, as Casey had touched on, the critically overdrafted basins, which the vast majority happen to be here in the Central Valley of California. Those plans were required to be submitted actually in January of last year. And those plans, as Casey had said, are currently being reviewed by the Department of Water Resources. Actually, just I think it was last week, the state came back actually responding on 2 basins, which actually were deemed to be deficient. And now we're required to address those deficiencies. One of those was in the Paso Robles. And then one basin actually was deemed to be compliant with its groundwater sustainability plan. And that was up in the Santa Cruz area. So that review is underway, but especially with this drought, it's estimated by PPIC, as it was historically, that we may see about 8 million acre feet of groundwater pumped. And it's quite certain by the end of this summer that kind of dramatic pumping, we will see some unavoidable consequences, which in turn will probably expedite some of the regulatory components of SCMA because of some of the unavoidable consequences associated with groundwater pumping.
Okay, we have a question from Peter asking, can you talk about which organizations are represented on the blueprint, those who represent ag, environment, and domestic supplies?
Sure, there's over 70 organizations which are participating in some manner in the blueprint, and another roughly 60 organizations that are participating in the Collaborative Action Program that I mentioned through Stanford University. I can, from a water agency standpoint, predominantly all of, especially here in the San Joaquin Valley, water agencies are represented through the overarching authorities as well as the districts themselves. So whether that includes the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority and its respective members, the Kings River Water Association, the Friant Water Authority, as well as state contractors and Kern County Water Agency. So from an overarching water standpoint, and then we've got the California Farm Bureau, the respective farm bureaus throughout the valley, organizations like Citrus Mutual, as well as California Fresh Fruit. We've got numerous dairy organizations, which are included in Fresno State. From an academic standpoint, we have refuge management organizations like Grasslands and others. But I'm happy to get over kind of a list of the current participants. But the goal really is to try to have a well-represented collective group that's as diversified as we can get, especially in the industry and valley.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
I think we have a website, waterblueprintca.com. Austin, can you?
.org.
Spencer on that.
Yep.
Okay, so the next question is from Ben. It is, will there be reductions from the Colorado to Southern California?
So just putting back on when I served at the Department of the Interior, so the kind of the drought management plan, which was entered into late in 2019 by the respective Colorado River interests, predominantly the states and the respective organizations, which had to come for the very first time to come up with kind of a plan to address reductions and what occurs if the overarching drought and lack of water supply occur. California is strongly positioned based upon its rights associated with the water supply off the Colorado, and there's a bit of a hierarchy based upon the lower basin states, and so Arizona really during those discussions for coming up with kind of this the drought contingency plan really had to look internally of where those shortages may be experienced, whether it was what it was going to be on the urban sector versus what it was going to be in agriculture. But at present, California is in a relatively strong position. But we'll see as if drought conditions persist. But at present, I don't think there are any reductions than were expected than further agreed to just a few years ago.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I'll invite Peter Nelson, who I know is asking some of these questions, who is probably the expert when it comes to Colorado River water systems. So Peter, you might weigh in on the chat as well. So.
All right, so we do have another question. As a greater percentage of water is dedicated to the environment, what scorecards or accountability is kept as to the actual benefit of the environment, such as fish numbers, better water quality reports, etc.?
So that's a really good question. I mean, some of you may be aware, so the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, which was passed, I think, in '94, I might be wrong on the date, but was one of those legislative considerations which was put into place to try to offset the impacts associated with the Central Valley Project. Just as a reminder, Central Valley Project is the Bureau of Reclamation's project, which pretty much runs water from Lake Shasta, which we've been talking about, as well as all the collective Eastern Sierra reservoirs, including the Eastern conveyance systems and the Western conveyance systems all the way down into Kern County, its largest conveyance system. And so one of those offsets was CVPIA, which established dollars as well as water supply to go to offset the impacts and to benefit the environment. And so there, even in this last administration, there was some review, kind of an accounting of what improvements have been made, what threshold or thresholds exist moving forward. Is there some measurement of success? That's always been somewhat of a challenge. And as we've seen, I don't think we've talked about it, Casey, but in the ongoing discussions regarding the voluntary agreements, somewhat in order to address the draft water quality control plans by the regional water control board, state water board, for phase 1 and phase 2 off the Sacramento and Feather systems, as well as off the San Joaquin tributaries. Those discussions are underway of what kind of measurement of water to lead in stream and what maybe corresponding dollars could be contributed for habitat improvement, but what measurements exist so that through adaptive management, how do we identify improvements, success, or the necessity to go back and do that? But that has been a lingering kind of question, I'd say, since CVPIA was passed, that exists with us today.
And maybe I'll just add that you had the biological opinions, federal biological opinions that were governing the Endangered Species Act. It was obvious that wasn't working. So the scorecard, the standards, was it improving delta smelt or other endangered species? I think the answer to that is no, it wasn't working. It was reducing water supplies and it wasn't helping fish. And it was under the Obama administration that it was started to revise those biological opinions, and it was finalized under the Trump administration. So I think there is a broad recognition that it's currently not working, state and federal government, and there's been updates to it, but it's still a little bit of a controversy and not fully implemented at this point. But I do think that there's a recognition that the current system doesn't work.
Okay, we have a question from Ben asking, what is the potential for increasing water storage in the county of LA?
I couldn't answer that, Ben. I think there are some other questions about Metropolitan, Southern California. I can say generally that Southern California, with a large population base, has invested more in water infrastructure, in storage capacity to withstand the drought. And so they're probably in a better position to go through these multiple years of drought than everybody else, because they can I don't want to say afford it, but it's a lot more cost effective for the average homeowner than it is to be able to make a living and still farm with that. And so they've made much more investments in water storage locally.
Okay, so we do have another question from an audience member. As an offset to SGMA, were any provisions made to maximize surface water availability to growers each year?
I'll start, and Austin can add to it if he knows better than I do. But no, I don't believe so. There are efforts. There's been the propositions, the bonds to try to bring more water storage. I think there's an effort in the San Joaquin Valley of Temperance Flat. There's Sites Reservoir, which has been funded with that money, but still not fully implemented. There was a few other projects. So I think there's a commitment from the state to have some projects, and there's funding behind it. This governor has a water resilience portfolio, which lists several actions that could be taken. But frankly, there's not a major effort by the state to invest in water storage to help implement SGMA. That's one reason why the water blueprint was formed. That's why we're getting together. We're pushing for projects that will help growers and bring more surface water supply, because one of the things that we've done with the blueprint is commission a study, the economic analysis of the impact of implementing SGMA, and it'll be devastating. And so while Governor Jerry Brown signed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, it's this Governor Newsom, who's going to have to actually implement it and live with the dire consequences if something's not done on surface water. And so no, the answer to that, short answer is no, but we're working every day to try to make sure that message is driven home within the halls of government.
And I'll just add, Casey, I think it was a great answer. Ultimately what we've seen through varying sources, so as Casey had said, whether it's Prop 1 funding and the respective water storage projects that were identified for funding, as well as through federal funding sources, in particular through the WIN Act, which was passed and signed during the Obama administration, and that provided some significant funding. But here in California, surface water storage projects, as we've been talking about, water's significantly complex and very political, and surface water storage projects are very challenging. And we're working on a system that is well over 40, 50, 60 years old, without really any increased storage. So a lot of focus. Again, there's really no silver bullet. There still needs to remain a focus on surface storage, and also a pursuit for groundwater storage, which is something that can be done in a more timely manner and tends to be less politically sensitive. But again, we need as much storage, especially what we're seeing through climate change. The Sierras just don't act as the storage facility that they once did with snowpack. And so we have to be able to capture that runoff to be able to hold it for years like this when we go through these drought cycles, which are inevitable.
Okay. So we do have a couple more questions. One is, how realistic is the blueprint, and is there actually the water needed to fill the blueprint? And then there's additional comment in for that question that says it will need 20 million acre feet of new storage and a transport to the eastern San Joaquin Valley, and that would cost tens or hundreds of billions. I'm not sure how accurate that is, or if you'd like to expand on that.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is, yes, in certain year types, there is enough water that moves through the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. When it is in excess, there is not the infrastructure in place to fully capture that and move it into the valley. And let's say if we were looking for groundwater storage, there are lands that are identified, but additional lands need to be identified, and lands in order to get that water to. The one thing that we haven't seen historically from a cost standpoint is the user base is much greater than it's ever been before. Predominantly, a lot of these projects weren't pursued because the underlying water contractors, who are the ones that repay the government and state government for those facilities, as well as pay to operate and maintain those facilities, it wasn't cost effective. But now with SGMA, we're seeing a much greater population of interested parties who, quite frankly, don't have any other alternatives associated with it. And so during those flashier and heavier excess timeframes, there are opportunities. The state of California is looking at its improvement projects associated with its pumping facilities, but repairing the existing infrastructure, as well as looking for opportunities to enhance the different infrastructure, are components that both the Bureau of Reclamation and the state have looked at over the years. And it's doing that in a coordinated manner in order to identify how that water can be picked up. Those excess supplies do exist. We had seen that through studies that the blueprint had engaged with MBK and Stantec engineering firms, and enhancing those facilities to move it when it's in excess to put in use. So it is a extremely daunting task, and one that is not easy to complete, but it's one that's worth pursuing, because the alternative, as Casey had mentioned, as we'd seen from Dr. Sundig's from UC Berkeley, his economic impact assessment, the alternatives are dire for the valley, and what it means for the communities that rely on water supplies and industry for its livelihood and services.
Okay, Casey, did you want to expand on that, or should I move to?
Nope.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. We have another question from Peter asking, how have water reclamation plants impacted water quality in the state and federal systems of SWP and CVP? Excellent. And we do have another question from Ben. For Southern California, is there sufficient water from metropolitan areas to meet agricultural needs despite the high prices?
Well, predominantly, so you're Metropolitan Southern California, which is a wholesale water provider and delivers water to its respective contractors within Southern California. Coming into this year, based upon water supplies that it has left in reservoirs within the Colorado, as well as water supplies coming out the State Water Project, which is what the water that runs down from the Delta, beginning at Lake Oroville, which is the state's anchor reservoir, and runs down the aqueduct up and over the Tehachapis. Met had indicated that it has numerous years of supply in order to meet its demands. And part of that is because of the conservation efforts that its contractors have made in Southern California, looking at alternative water supplies, including desalination, but also just conserved water. So it has enough water to meet its needs at present, even during this drought, and is expected to for the next couple of years, should it continue.
Okay, so it looks like we just have one more question before we conclude. The question is, when will we be seeing construction of the water project from the Prop 1 bonds?
That's an excellent question. I think there are a number of factors underway. I think the project proponents, including sites like Casey had mentioned, are eager to get going. There are numerous ones that are at varying stages. Now, some of those projects have also been faced with some recent litigation of sorts, but I think a project like Contra Costa's Los Vaqueros project is probably one that you'll see the soonest, just based upon its enhancement of an existing facility and what they've been able to do. Something that's new, like sites, which hopefully comes online, off-stream storage projects like that, are a little bit more palatable, but it's still probably a ways away from being completed. I mean, started and completed.
Okay, thank you so much. So with that, I think I'm going to pass this over to Melinda for closing remarks. Melinda, take it away.
Thank you. So again, on behalf of the Citrus Research Board, I'd like to thank Ben, Casey, and Austin for sharing this information with our participants at today's webinar. I think it was a very good discussion, a lot of good information. So thank you for your time today. We do hope to see everyone next week at our final webinar on June 22nd, where speaker Cindy Fake will provide a regional update, and Doctors Tracy Kahn and Mike Roos will provide an update on the results of their multi-location lemon, scion, and rootstock trials. Also, mark your calendars for our in-person California Citrus Conference on October 6th, up here in Visalia, California. For additional information, please visit our website at citrusresearch.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda, for being here. Thank you to the Citrus Research Board, and we hope you have a great rest of your day, everyone.